try to do is understand what consumers want to eat. So my presentation today is going to have two parts. The first part will be some general consumer trends. And the reason I want to touch on those is we feel like these are the most important trends for all food producers, all food buyers to think about. These are things that consumers now are moving towards. They're not fads, they're changes in the way they're thinking about food. How can we differentiate our product? How can we talk about local in a way that's more meaningful than some of those big companies that are talking about it? Then in the second part of the presentation, I'm truly going to get into the details of how to tell your story. What is it about your product or yourself or your company that makes you special? If you take all these trends and then on top of it layer on what your story is, your narrative, that's what's going to make you stand out. So to kick things off in consumer trends, we found that culture has really shifted in the last 50 years. Consumers are seeking really more unique eating experiences. Consumer demand, what consumers want, is driving what food companies are making. It's more fun, it's more experiential. People are eating differently throughout the day. And now things that are mass produced are actually seen as bad. It's no longer good to have that consistency. That's boring. What consumers want is something different, something special, something unique. When they buy the cookies, they want every cookie to look a little bit different, to be a different size and shape. They don't want to make it, they want it to look like it's come out of a food processing plant somewhere. So culture is truly shifting over the long term. And how consumers describe products is shifting. They're starting to bucket food into one of two categories. It's either this idea of industrial food or junk food, as they often call it, or real food. Now, industrial food to them is cheese that comes out of a tube. They might sometimes still eat it. There's some nostalgia there for some of these products. But really, increasingly, they're saying that's not food. Real food is what they can envision actually being grown somewhere, something they could potentially make at home. And increasingly, they're moving towards real food. And people are shopping differently. If you go to a grocery store these days, and many of you probably shop this way, you're probably just hitting the perimeter of the store. They just tell us, I just hit all the fresh categories in the store, the bakery, the produce, the meat, the dairy, and then I'm out of there. I don't want to eat packaged goods or processed goods anymore. So really, in large part, mainstream Americans are trying to move away from processed goods. It's a longer-term journey. It's going to take a while. But now even on mainstream programs and mainstream media, we see experts in the field talking about moving away from packaged goods, and consumers are starting to follow that advice. The meaning of good food is changing in consumers, and this is where health and wellness really plays a role. Now what good food is starting to mean is not about just the absence of things or just the presence of things. It's basically this idea of fresh food, real food, less processed food, high quality food, premium food. And even premium food these days means health to consumers. So health is not just about nutritional elements. It's also about food consumers feel good about because it's real. Health and wellness these days does not have to be about calorie counts. It has to be about products that are fresh, real, and less processed. If you are doing a finished product, you need to take a lot of care in terms of what's in that final product. We see every year numerous consumers, more and more, starting to look at ingredient labels. And if they turn over an ingredient label and there's a lot of ingredients in a product, they instantly think, it's probably not that good, it's probably not that healthy. If there's any of the ingredients that have X's and Y's and Z's in them, anything that may sound like it's sort of produced somewhere as an additive, they put it down. So there's a lot of subjective cues right now to consumers, what they're looking for. They're looking for no additives, no preservatives, no artificial ingredients, just getting rid of all that bad stuff. What are some of the cues they use? Being able to see what's in the package. Somewhat counterintuitively, expiration dates. When we go to consumers' homes and they pick up things in their pantry and they look at the expiration date and it's like 3 years out, they say, God, what must be in there to make it last for 3 years? It's not a positive anymore. Putting images of raw ingredients rather than a final product. And finally, if you are getting into stores, whatever you can do to get in the perimeter of that store. So second big trend, consumers increasingly wanting to know more about the product life cycle. Used to be consumers just cared about when they used it. Now they're starting to think about, well, what do I do with it after I use it? Is it recyclable? Is there something I can do with the packaging? And moving back in the supply chain, how is this grown? How is it harvested? What sort of production or process did it go through? They're thinking about many more elements of that product life cycle, and they want more information from you on each of those pieces. And there's a host of things consumers are seeking when they're at the shelf. This is a list of the types of terms and phrases consumers look for, what's important to them. You can't just put these on your package and think that's going to sell it, because you still have to tell your story. But these are important pieces to think about when you're telling the consumer how your product was made, how it was grown, how it was raised. Natural is a term that a lot of consumers are throwing around these days. We call it sort of a marker word. It describes what they're looking for. You know, natural to them means no additives, no preservatives, no pesticides. It's got a lot of baggage as a marketing word. So if you're thinking about marketing your product as natural, think again, because unfortunately, a lot of the big companies who've been marketing around natural have sort of ruined that word for many consumers. Consumers are starting to be pretty suspicious. So we'd say natural, albeit a good word to use in our industry. If we're thinking about what to tell consumers, we should think about other ways to describe the product because of the baggage associated with this. Origin of ingredients. 63% of all consumers, when you talk to them about what food quality means, it's not just about how the food tastes, how it looks, it's also about where the product came from. 69% of consumers, when they think about food quality, aren't just thinking about how the product looks, how it tastes, but how is it made? It's now about that story behind it, what's going on behind the scenes. Where is it coming from? How was it made? How did it get into their home? Local, there's been so much buzz about local. Certainly now that the big boys are getting on board with local, we know it's a legitimate trend. But local is multifaceted. It has so many meanings for consumers. It's about buying from someone they know. It's about generating employment. It's about keeping money circulating locally. It's also about their belief that the products are fresher because they haven't traveled as far. So local continues to be something that grows, and consumers define it very differently from consumer to consumer. We can't just talk about being local anymore. We've got to talk about what makes our product differentiated for some of the products these big companies are talking about. And then sustainability. And I want to touch on sustainability just for a moment, because what we're finding in our research is that sustainability is about so much more than just environmental or green. I think there's this idea when we talk about sustainability, it just means green. There's this element of social sustainability that's it's very important to consumers, it's increasing. And what that means is they care about the people behind the product. So whether it's the working conditions for the people who make the product, whether it's animal welfare, how the animals are treated in production, whether it's if the company's supporting the community in which the product's being made, social sustainability is very important. It's that human element, that human touch. And in a recent study we found when we talked about food service establishments, so everything from fast food to fast casual to restaurants, consumers said that those types of establishments that treated their employees well with good benefits and a great workplace exceeded any other environmental criteria. So this idea of how do you treat your people, how do you treat the communities in which you're growing your product is one that not a lot of companies are talking about. Consumers truly care about it. It's a great opportunity if you can tell some of those stories. At the same time that we've got this local trend going on, we're finding that consumers increasingly are getting much more open to a diversity of taste profiles. They're increasingly seeking new types of products. If there's some sort of thing that's different, that's more global, it's not considered typical American food, this is getting increasingly important to consumers. They're experimenting with new tastes, they're experimenting with new rituals around how to eat. One of the reasons for that is they think it's healthier. And basically they say, look, Americans, we're just not that healthy with our diet. Almost every other country in the world has better success with their health rates. Maybe we should be eating differently. So long-term change, how consumers are looking at global taste preferences. The way in which consumers are eating is changing. It is absolutely no longer about consumers just eating 3 meals a day. We're now finding that over half, 55% of consumers are basically just grazing throughout the day. You know, they're either eating small meals all day, they're having snacks. It's just constantly feeling like they have to have something to eat throughout the day. So thinking about where your product fits into that, it doesn't just have to be a product they eat at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. We're looking at various occasions now, and there's like 10 different eating occasions for consumers. You know, it's the pre-breakfast, the breakfast, the post-breakfast, the lunch, the post-lunch, the afternoon snack, the dinner, the after-dinner, and then the fourth meal. You guys heard about the fourth meal? Taco Bell's actually advertising the fourth meal. Go have another huge meal at about 11 o'clock at night. Probably not good long-term for obesity rates in our country, but something to think about in terms of how you position your product. It doesn't just have to be for a meal anymore. It could be any time of day. Storytelling is something that's extremely important to consumers in this day and age because they want to feel like they have a connection to who is making their food. It's no longer just about the functional benefits of the food product. It's got to be about how do they feel about that company, how do they feel about the food product. And that can be expressed through stories on the package, through stories on a website, through your stories when you're meeting someone, the materials you put your product in. You know, if it has a certain tactile feel, it's going to give consumers potentially cues that it's more environmentally friendly, for example. So storytelling is key. It's increasing in importance over time. Obviously, the story's got to be true. I would not stand up here and tell you to start making up stories about your product or your company. So there's got to be a true story. But you know what? It doesn't have to be a huge story. It doesn't have to be some huge aha moment or some story about how you discovered this new ingredient. It can be just a quirky story, a fun story, a heartfelt story. But it's got to be true. It's got to be based in something. It's got to be compelling. I doubt that many people in this room have a product that's a commodity product that they're probably just trying to sell at the lowest price. You wouldn't come to this conference if your goal was just to, get your product out there in the marketplace at the absolute lowest price. There's probably something special about your product, whether it's the type of product itself, how you grow it, how you process it, what your company stands for, what your values are. It's got to be something compelling and differentiated from what's already out there. If you're just another Me Too product, there's really no point in telling a narrative. You might as well then just sell it at the lowest price. And finally, it's got to have this emotional hook, as we call it, with consumers. It can't just be about a functional benefit. It can't just be about, oh, well, it's got more antioxidants. There's got to be something there that hits at consumers' heartstrings, something that makes them feel good about that story. They want to read it. And we find this when we do our research that consumers get emotionally attached to a lot of products that have these stories. They talk to their friends about them, neighbors about them. I mean, the idea of the social networking that goes on among friends and colleagues when they find a product they love is really incredible. It's the most valuable resource, obviously, you can have. So what is that emotion behind your product? What's that story? There's all sorts of different types of narratives. First one I talk about is the founder or the owner narrative. This is the people narrative. And consumers love this idea. It's like the idea of going to the farmer's market, which yes is about fresh products, yes it's about local, but it's also about shaking the guy's hand who actually dug up those potatoes that morning and still has the dirt under his fingernails. So it's this social element that's so important about this story. So the founder can tell about the moment when the company was created, talk about the values behind the product. What are the consumers looking for? Obviously, they're looking for someone who shares the same sort of values and beliefs. They're looking for those beliefs to be relevant to their lifestyle, and they're looking for inspiration. So if there's a great, a story behind how the product came to be that you want to tell them and you're comfortable telling them that story, to give them something to aspire to, it'd be an ideal way to go about telling your narrative. What are some examples? One is Shepherd's Grain. Another example you may or may not have heard of is Dave's Killer Bread. Two examples of small companies that have really made their way and gotten by on the strength and the conviction and the passion of their founders who've gone out there and told their story. Another narrative is about the product, a varietal narrative. So whether it's a heirloom varietal, it's a bean, it's a grain, tomato obviously best well known, whether it's a type of heritage meat, but having something special about your product. That's another great way to get your story out, especially if you're not as comfortable with talking about your own personal story. Why do consumers like the story about the product, about varietals? Well, it harkens back to the way things used to be, sort of how their grandparents used to eat. There's some nostalgia there that's important to them. There's also an appeal here in terms of sustainability, wanting to eat a diversity of food products, not having everything be, the tomato that lasts forever on your counter, wanting things to be diverse, they think is positive for their own health as well as the health of the planet. Muir Glen Organic is doing something really interesting. So a larger company example of doing this. And then on the right, certainly, there's so many companies right now that are promoting heritage meats. A process narrative, so a production narrative. Production narrative is telling the story of how the product came to be. How did it get to their table? Was there something about it? Was there an artisanal technique that took place while you were making that product? If more care went into the product, if there's an element of a human being part of that process. So these types of narratives add interest, and again, there's this idea of nostalgia. If it was an artisanal technique and it was the way something used to be made, that's seen as a plus to consumers. Then the final narrative is the place narrative, the geographic origin narrative that I think works particularly well in our geography of the Pacific Northwest. For many consumers, there's a belief that certain types of products should only come from certain places. They only want to eat apples that come from Washington State. Their potatoes are only going to come from Idaho, et cetera. And local here, again, plays a role, whether it's a boundary that consumers define as very localized or very broad. And the idea of terroir, which wine has used so well, imbuing a certain quality to an end product because of where it was grown, is now making its way out of the wine category into the food category, even among mainstream consumers. How can you communicate your story? You've got to choose the story that's most relevant for you. It's got to be something that is going to be compelling to consumers. We've talked about some here, the place, the product, the process. There's others as well. For some of you, you might have, maybe you have a retail store somewhere, and as you decide to expand more regionally or nationally, you can talk about that original storefront, which is actually what Muir Glen did up in Cedar Woolley so well. They still have the farm stand up there. The narrative has to be true, obviously, compelling and differentiated for what else is out there. So look and see what your competitors are doing and find where that space is, that white space where there's not a story that's similar to yours. You've got to get out and tell the story. Some people are more comfortable than others. If you're not comfortable, find someone on your team that is. These are not stories you can tell just by putting it in a brochure, or just putting it on your website, or just giving someone a flyer. There's got to be a human touch here, a human element. And if you're not the one who can do it, you've got to find someone on your team who you trust, who's going to be around for the long haul, who can tell your story. You don't have to be a marketing pro. In fact, being slick at this is a bad thing. People want you to be honest. You've got to be compelling, honest, passionate, and importantly, concise. You've got to be able to do it in 15 seconds or so when you're in front of that buyer or that chef. That's only going to give you the minimum amount of time to tell your story. If they're interested, you can tell them a lot more behind it, but figure out what are those points that are going to be most compelling to them and make it very short and sweet. Practice. Start telling your story to your friends, your family, move on to neighbors, move on to the buyers, try to get some reporters, very local reporters to talk to you, but speak about your story to a diversity of audiences to get the feedback. So I thank you for your attention. I am delighted now to welcome